our series on religion, slavery, and the U.S. Civil War. I have appreciated everyone's good attentiveness. We've had some really challenging and good questions asked, both in email form to me and, of course, in our live conversations as well. And I appreciated you guys being part of this for the last few weeks. And I hope you will continue to support the Sunday Seminary series. As you can see, we're doing a wide array of topics. I am, of course, have taken a historical, theological bent. Dr. Hill is going to focus on the theme of leadership during these terrible times, beginning in the first week of September. And then, of course, Dr. Miner did a series on the Bible, and Dr. Davis and Dr. Gadke chose to look at sort of ethical and pastoral questions that the pandemic are challenging our churches with. So I think you'll find throughout the year, we provide a whole bunch of different topics for you to kind of work with. I would really appreciate it. And in fact, more than me, Martha Park, our communications director, would very much appreciate if you could send any words of support to her via email here. She has asked repeatedly for that. She's gotten quite a few this week. She's very appreciative of that. But if you could say some, nice things about the program, about one of the presenters, like me, for example, I enjoy hearing nice things. And so does Dr. Gadke and Dr. Hill and Dr. Miner and Dr. Davis, of course. So words of support are very much welcome. If you want to watch some of the archive lessons, they're all on our webpage, Memphis Seminary / Sunday Seminary. You can find all of the previous lessons that I've done, including copies of my PowerPoints and a bibliography, all on that site, as well as the lessons Dr. Miner, Dr. Gadke, and Dr. Davis completed a few weeks ago. And then if you have any questions, particularly for me, or if you want me to come and speak to your church group at some point about some of what we're getting into today or other weeks, my email address is here. I'd love to hear from you. And of course, if you ever have any interest in auditing a class at Memphis Theological Seminary, you can contact our admissions office. We love having community auditors. And this year, everything's going to be online. So it's super easy to do if you want to audit a class, at least this semester. All right. So, and of course, if you want to make a donation to support this program and other ministries, we very much appreciate it. I can't tell you how much even small dollar donations make a difference to MTS. I mean, my experience has been that $100 donation to MTS goes a heck of a lot further than a $1,000 or $10,000 donation to a much bigger cause. We are a lean organization that prides ourselves on really doing good work in the city, and we really appreciate the community support we get. All right, so that's the sales pitch. Let's jump into the lesson. Today, what we're going to look at is the theme of God's providence and the Civil War. At least that's the fancy title I'm giving it. We're going to try to understand the question of how can God be for both sides, the North and the South, because both sides claim that God was on their side. And then at the end of our time today, we're going to look a little bit at why this matters today and why the Civil War matters today. There's a couple images on this slide that I think are worth pointing out. The first is of a sanitary fair. If you have studied Civil War history, you probably know about the U.S. Sanitary Commission, but the Sanitary Commission was one of those big relief organizations designed to help Union soldiers, and it was largely supported and started by religious folks and supported by religious churches, of course. The second image is one of my favorite. This is a Matthew Brady, the great photographer of the Civil War era, a Matthew Brady photograph of a priest. This is a Roman Catholic priest in the war camps. This is the famous, we think, Fighting 69th, which is an Irish Catholic unit in the Union Army. It's a really cool image that kind of shows a chaplain in action, in my opinion. All right. Okay, so let's just start with some basics. It's fair to say, I've been watching a lot of political conventions this week, and I probably will next week as well, right? It's fair to say that many Americans believe that our country is set apart, that we're special, that God has a special place for us in God's divine plan, that America is something extraordinary. Maybe you don't believe that, maybe you do, but it's something that Americans have long believed collectively. I mean, honestly, well before the Civil War, well before the American Revolution, that was something that many Americans believe. Maybe a few of you are old enough to remember when Ronald Reagan ran for president. I was very, very small when that happened in 1980, but I will not shock you, I'm a bit of a presidential history buff. In fact, I grew up collecting presidential campaign pins. That was my first big hobby. I was very cool as a child. And I dated late in life. But regardless, Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1980. And you may remember that he was very fond of quoting. What you have to love about Reagan's campaigns, even if you don't like his politics, or maybe you do, but what you have to love about Reagan's campaign was that he was always so optimistic. His vision for America was always so optimistic. And he liked to talk about America being a shining city upon a hill. Now that's a phrase he used a few times throughout his various campaigns, most famously in an address he gave on the eve of Election Day in 1980. That phrase, a shining city upon a hill, is this idea that America is somehow set apart, separate, and something special for the world to look upon. This is language not about America, but this language of a shining city on a hill is language straight out of Matthew chapter 5, verse 14. And Reagan appropriated it from the Puritans. If you remember, the Puritans came to America in the 17th century. And in 1630, before the largest ship of Puritan settlers would take off from England, their governor, John Winthrop, would give a sermon in which he stated that we were going to build a shining city on a hill in America. That's what the Puritans were going to do. And that city would stand as an example of how a virtuous Christian civilization could look to the rest of the world. And if we're faithful to God, then God will be faithful to us. We'll be prosperous, if you will. That idea of America being special or set apart was really prominent in the 19th century and in the Civil War era in particular. Americans had called it in the first half of the century manifest destiny, or this idea that America was uniquely special and virtuous, and because of that, the expansion of our American civilization was a good thing. And eventually, America was going to take over even the entirety of North America. Manifest destiny. Americans thought God was on their side. And I probably should caveat all this by saying that a lot of terrible things have happened in history because of Americans' sense of their unique purpose, such as what happened to the native peoples. And we could get into that another time. It's obviously a terrible story, I would argue. But Americans have always believed that God was on their side. We were a good guy. There was something special about us. One of the problems we have during the Civil War era, and one of many reasons that it's such a traumatic event, is because both Northerners and Southerners were absolutely convinced their side was the side of justice. They were the ones on God's side. God was on their side. This is a famous painting, 1872. It's an allegorical representation of the New West and of this idea of manifest West and of destiny. It's called American Progress. I told you before, and I guess I'll tell you again, Abraham Lincoln, I continue to say, was the great theologian of the Civil War. We looked at this last week. This was a private writing Lincoln put together. The underlinings are his. The will of God prevails. In great contest, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. Lincoln always tried to reposition. The question is not whose side is God on, but whether or not we are on God's side. And in a war as bloody as the Civil War, sometimes you wonder if, the real question isn't where have we failed God? The violent conflict that was the Civil War cost between 620,000 and 800,000 soldier deaths. It was the bloodiest war. It remains the bloodiest war in U.S. history, at least in terms of American casualties. In fact, the total number of soldier deaths far exceeds the combined totals of the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II in Korea all together. This is the Bloody Lane, the burial of bodies in Antietam in 1862. Let's back up a bit. So we talked last week at great length about Abraham Lincoln, his own struggle in terms of religious faith and what that kind of meant for America. We also looked at the Emancipation Proclamation and the role that religious leaders played in helping shape that document. In 1860, Lincoln emerges as the nominee of the Republican Party. It's important to realize the Republican Party was brand new in 1860. It was this coalition of sort of defunct parties like the Know Nothings and the Whigs. It also contained a fairly strong abolitionist element and a number of free soilers who really weren't pro-abolition but were anti-slavery. And we could go into more length about that another time. But Lincoln would win the election largely because the Democrat Party actually split along southern and northern lines and had a northern Democrat candidate and a southern Democrat candidate. And as you can see, Lincoln squeaked by and won the election with just under 40% of the total votes. So his election was incredibly controversial, to put it lightly. And it was so controversial because many folks believed that Lincoln's major object would be to end slavery. Despite some of the narrative we talked about last week, then a number of southern states secede from the Union. And then after the first shots are fired at Fort Sumter, which we'll talk more about in a moment, we have a number of other states succeeding. The stars and bars, by the way, which I showed in the previous slide, was actually the first flag of the Confederacy. And you'll notice that the number of stars on it actually changes as more states enter the Confederacy. What we now think of as the Confederate flag was actually the flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. But it's, of course, the most enduring image of the Confederacy. Okay. So in the days following Lincoln's inauguration on March 4th, rumors began to circulate widely that the South needed to react. There was fear. The Southerners were concerned that what will the Union do next? Will they leave us be? And the atmosphere in South Carolina was particularly tense. South Carolina had, of course, succeeded December 20th, 1860, and it was very tense there. And the case of a small Union fort in Charleston Harbor was, to put it lightly, particularly a concerning one. This fort, which is where most of the Union regiments had gone in South Carolina following secession, was small and it desperately needed to be restocked. So Lincoln was in this strange situation of needing to decide exactly what to do. And he made a move. He decided to minimally restock the fort. He even sent a few reinforcements, but they were very small in the grand scheme of things. But he sent reinforcements and supplies to restock that little fort in Charleston Harbor. This was seen as an act of war by the Southerners. This is from the Charleston Mercury. Now the issue of battle is to be forced upon us. We will meet the invader, and the God of battles must decide the issue between the hostile hirelings of abolition hate and northern tyranny and of the fort. Now, I want to be clear. Lincoln anticipated this was going to happen. He could have sent much stronger regiments to back up the fort. Lincoln's goal was to provoke the Confederates' first shots, if you will, which would, in his mind, be politically advantageous, perhaps give him a bit of, in his mind, and in the Union's mind, a moral victory. All right. So the first shots are fired at Fort Sumter. The war begins between the states. It would go on to be this bloody battle, this bloody war, rather, this terrible, terrible atrocity and catastrophe in American history. But no one quite knew how bad it was going to be when those first shots were fired. I think Union forces legitimately thought the war would be short, that they would completely overpower the South, and the South legitimately thought they could back the North up and settle terms for their independence. So the newly formed Confederacy rationalized that this war had been brought on by corruption in the North. I mean, in addition to the fact they believed that the North had broken the Constitution, they also firmly believed that part of the problem in the northern states was that the northern officials, the Union folks in both the Army and the government, certainly Lincoln himself, were all fundamentally corrupt bureaucrats. They were unchristian, unvirtuous, deeply problematic. And so the Confederacy rationalized that the surest way to victory was faithfulness to God. At least faithfulness is how they can perceived it. And to that end, they desired, the Confederates became convinced that the problems with the Union had existed from the beginning. The founding fathers themselves were, many of them were corrupt and unvirtuous and not particularly Christian, many came to believe. So the people put a lot of pressure on their government to be holy, chaste. They even introduced a bill in 1861, in May of 1861, to recognize the Confederacy's dependence on overruling Providence, as they would call it. But Christian rhetoric, quotations from the Bible and beyond, were a constant part of what was happening in the Confederacy in the South during this era. This is one of the most famous theologians in the South in the 19th century, a man by the name of James Henley Thornwell, who was Presbyterian. And while I disagree with almost all of his conclusions, there's no doubt that he is a prolific, brilliant theologian in many ways. He declared that the new Constitution should be amended, the one being put together by the Confederacy, to make it known that the Confederacy was ultimately in submission to Jesus, because to Jesus all power in heaven and earth is committed. They wanted God in their government, or so the rhetoric goes. And in fact, the first major anthem of the South is the National Confederate Anthem, somewhat unofficial, but it was what government folks hoped to make the official, was God Save the South. Not Old Dixie, as many of you probably know much better, but God Save the South. And some of the lyrics are this: God save the South, God save the South, her altars and firesides, God save the South. Now that the war is nigh, now that we arm to die, chanting our battle cry, freedom or death, chanting our battle cry, freedom or death. And the theological language is really robust throughout this song. And in fact, it's one of the few pieces of music in that age to actually get sort of sheet cover music, which is put together. More famous is Dixie, or I Wish I Was in Dixieland, which I'm sure most of you have heard. If you don't know the words to, you at least have heard. Dixieland actually was more popular among the soldiers and the rank and file people. It actually was also popular in the North, ironically. In fact, Abraham Lincoln, who was born in Dixie, loved the song and used it at campaign events, rather ironically now, given that this has become a song kind of associated with the South and with the South during the antebellum and war periods. It was a song that had emerged with the blackface minstrel shows. And there even were Northern Army boys who changed some of the words to it and sang it in the war camps. They would say, away down south in the land of traitors, rattlesnakes and alligators, right away, come away, right away, come away, where cotton's king and men are chattels, Union boys will win the battle, right away, come away, right away, come away. It's a very contagious song, and it was incredibly popular throughout the 19th century. Okay. So during the war years itself, churches played a huge role in supporting their respective causes, and nowhere was this more true than the South. We talked a couple weeks ago about how large, particularly the Baptists and the Methodists, and to some extent the Presbyterians were in the South. Well, these churches did a great deal to support the Confederacy during the war eras. They did so in a few ways. I mean, first and foremost, preachers preached highly nationalistic messages from the pulpit. They promoted the war from the pulpit in a way that probably some of you would not be comfortable with your preachers doing on Sunday morning today. But they did so. They were in times even tried to encourage people signing up for the military. Preachers were the most important leaders in their communities in many ways. American people were highly religious. And with that office comes a great deal of power, and Southern preachers used it to promote the war. Now, that happened in the North, too. And then the denominations used their vast resources to support the war effort. In fact, the biggest presses in America in the 19th century were, for the most part, religious presses. You know, the Methodists and Baptists and other groups had their own religious presses, and they promoted, at times, secular political literature using their presses, in addition to very religiously infused language to support the war effort. And you'll find very political quotes in constant, widely read Southern church periodicals. I mean, this is a good one from the Methodist Christian Advocate. The war was waged by trained bands and fanatic legions upon a peaceful but separate people who had simply determined as equal and original partners to withdraw formally from the government compact, the spirit and letter of which they themselves have broken. There is no middle ground. He that is not for the South at this hour is against her. You see that those familiar truisms that I would argue are not true at all, that would become very commonplace for Southerners to say to support the war. This idea that the war was being waged by the North, Northerners were oppressors, the South was blameless for what was going on, no mention of slavery whatsoever. Or this one from a Methodist pastor. Your cause is the cause of God, the cause of Christ, of humanity. It is conflict of truth with error, of Bible with Northern infidelity, of pure Christianity with Northern fanaticism. Again, first week, if you were with me then, we talked about how the sort of the controversy over how to interpret the Bible when it came to slavery. Well, Southerners would argue that the Northerners had given up on biblical literacy and certainly literalism. Because of that, they were deeply sinful. They were pretty much infidels in the North. We're the ones who stand on the side of God because we read the Bible the right way and take it seriously, where these Northerners are just throwing it out. So the first major battle of the war was the First Battle of Bull Run, and I'm not going to give you a play-by-play of battle history. Maybe there's just a couple people in the chat who can do that. It's a fascinating, bloody battle. Essentially, the Confederacy won a very unlikely and surprising victory, largely because the Northern commander, General Irwin McDowell, sort of made a mess of a flank, which created opportunities for Southerners to come in. But it was a bloody, nasty battle that cost a lot of lives. The Southerners would take a lot of prisoners of war out of it. It was a terrible, terrible battle. But what was surprising about this terrible battle was that the Confederacy won. Literally, they were surprised by this. And this was seen as a providential sign by many in the South. Many people in the South took this as a sign that God was indeed on their side and that this war would in fact be won. It was seen as a work of God, and Confederate ministers would interpret it as such. At a Presbyterian Synod meeting in Staunton, Virginia, there would be ministers who were weeping about how wonderful God had blessed the Confederacy in this battle. One minister would say, almost before the weeping worshipers had risen from their knees, the answer came, and gloriously did God at length avenge his own elect. God's looking out for us. We're the chosen people, we in the South. This is from another observer, a great Christian woman, Judith McGuire in the South. Oh, that providence would now interpose and prevent further bloodshed. Oh, that strength may be given to our men. God was on our side. Southern churches follow suit. They raise money for the war effort in large amounts. They, used their church buildings at times to work as storehouses, gathering places, hospitals, and shelters during the war. This is an interesting photo too, by the way. This is a photo of Ulysses S. Grant and the troops at a Baptist church in Fredericksburg, Virginia. As we'll talk about in a few minutes, the Union would actually take over a large number of churches as they conquered territory. But it's fair to say that in the early days of the war in particular, churches served a very pivotal role for Southerners, and military role at that. In fact, they would also ship Bibles to soldiers in the Confederacy and things along those lines, but they raised money and supplied goods for the soldiers. Somewhat interestingly as well, Confederate chaplains became incredibly important people, though I've got to say that despite the supposed religiosity of the South, because there was always a manpower shortage, they never had quite enough chaplains. There was always a shortage of those, and it wasn't quite the priority it was in the North, shockingly enough. I think largely because the South was constantly under siege and constantly at a manpower disadvantage compared to the North. But they did make an effort, and chaplains would become very visible figures in the military ranks. Their initial salary was about $1,000 a year, though because of financial cutbacks, it got cut down to about $600 at one point during the war, and then later raised back to $960. You know, clergy salaries haven't been raised all that much in the last 100 years. I'm joking. So it's fair to say that the Southerners really did believe that they were on God's side. And early on, battles started to break the Confederacy's way in the war. One of the reputations of some of the soldiers, though, was that early on, many of the soldiers were thought of as kind of irreligious. In fact, there are all these accounts of soldiers riding back home and complaining about card playing and drinking and other acts that were seen as sinful in the 19th century going on in the military ranks. But some of the Confederate leaders were seen as particularly religious, and none is, of course, more famous than Robert E. Lee. And I'll talk a minute about Robert E. Lee. I'm always a little hesitant to know how to address Robert E. Lee because he is such a figure of folkloric proportions in the South. And I would argue some of that's earned and some of that is not earned from him or has been a later interpretation of him. But Robert E. Lee, whose dates are 1807 to 1870, was a very famous military man who was from the family of famous military men, in fact. His father was Light Horse Harry Lee III, who had served in the Revolutionary War. Lee's family was an old military family, among the oldest in the country. And he became the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia in April of 1861. And this was after he had turned down a fairly prominent post in the Union Army. He was not someone who was initially in favor of succession. In fact, early on, he had been a supporter of the Union, but he changed his mind in the early days of the war. And he would distinguish himself, as you likely know, as one of the most important commanders of the Confederacy. He was a very talented tactician. There is no lying about that. He absolutely was. And he won a large number of battles, more than he lost. His fatal problem, as many Civil War historians have pointed out, is that he tended to be very aggressive. And unfortunately, with aggressive military tactics, you tend to take high casualty rates. And that did tend to undermine some of Lee's success. But more important for our purposes, Lee was seen as a deeply religious man. And I would argue that's true. He was. He read the Bible and prayed regularly. He was a very devout Episcopalian. In fact, he supported sort of a low church pro-revival wing of the Episcopalian Church in Virginia. But it was an important part of who he was. In fact, he was fond of quoting scripture. And he even, on some occasions, procured copies of the Book of Common Prayer, which is used by the Episcopalians, and the Bible for some of his men. And there are lots of accounts of Robert E. Lee quietly praying in the woods by himself and soldiers stumbling across him. He was seen as a deeply religious man. But while that's true, and I would argue Lee was a deeply Christian man in his beliefs, he was also a slaveholder, and he was somebody who did have beliefs that I think you can safely say supported white supremacy. Now, he was product of his time. I'll give him that. But he famously inherited 189 slaves from his father-in-law. He chose not to release them immediately, though he did eventually make a plan to release them within 5 years. But there are accounts of him beating or ordering the beatings of slaves who had escaped. He himself, even after the war, would not show a lot of support for the freedmen. So Lee is somebody whose narrative needs to be understood in that context too. And we could go on about that, and we can in the questions if you would like to. But Lee was seen as a deeply religious man by many of his soldiers. He endorsed prayer meetings. He regularly quoted scripture. What he didn't succeed in doing was always giving his men Sabbath off for worship, because ultimately during war that can be incredibly challenging. There were several other Confederate commanders that were also very religious. Famously, Stonewall Jackson was also, who would die in battle, was also, or died actually accidentally shot by his own men. But he was someone who was also seen as deeply devout Calvinist Christian. This is a really strange image that hangs in the Ogden Museum of Southern Art. It's terrible, isn't it? It's kind of corny looking. It's that kind of terrible that you would almost frame it, put it in your house, and then point it out to everybody who comes in and tell them it's terrible, right? Because it's a conversation starter. But this is, of course, Robert E. Lee, a white Jesus Christ, and Elvis Presley. One of the most surprising things that happened during the war years is that revivals actually began to break out in the war camps. In fact, the Confederacy in particular became known for these. Again, revivals were what groups like the Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians were actually known for in the early 19th century. But what actually starts to happen is that as the war years begin to turn more and more against the South, which really happens beginning in 1863 or so, the rank and file men begin to turn to their Bibles more and more. We have lots of accounts of this, and particularly in Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Again, you have a commander who supports this. You have conversions, revivals breaking out widely in the ranks. And the most important revivals would break out in the fall of 1863 and in the summer of the following year. There are numerous very interesting accounts of this, of people kind of falling over prostrate, having powerful conversion experiences, and so forth and so on. This is a chaplain who wrote an account of it, J.J.D. Renfro. We estimated the conversions of them at 550. I baptized about 100. Brother Cumbie about 50, and most of the others joined the Methodist. This work, as you know, prevailed nearly through all the army. Okay, so what I've tried to show is how much Southerners believed that God was on their side, and that in no small part they believed that one of the keys to winning the war was to read the Bible, be virtuous, be Christian in their own mind, which they associated heavily with personal morality and personal spirituality. But it's also important to realize that many Northerners thought that God was on their side too. In fact, famously, many Northern clergy persons who had preached against the war before Fort Sumter changed their mind and began to argue that God was on the side of the North and that this war was a holy war, a just war. They weren't quoting famous theologians like Augustine or Aquinas, as Dr. Gatke would teach about when he's teaching about just war theory, but they were arguing that the Bible justifies this war. We are on the side of righteousness. Now, some of that came from abolition. The abolitionists, most of whom were deeply Christian, as we've seen in previous lessons, very much argued that abolishing slavery was the goal of this war. And it's a holy cause. We're on the side of God here. I mean, there were cases like this one, a Northern preacher who had preached pacifism all of his life, disregarded those principles after Fort Sumter, and instead he took Luke 22:36 as his passage. Then said he unto them, he that hath no sword, let him sell his garments and buy one. I'm not sure that's what Jesus meant, but regardless, you've heard that kind of message from pulpit constantly. In fact, it's in this era that U.S. flags become ubiquitous. They become commonplace inside churches for really the first time in history. Some of you probably go to church today that has a flag in it. I mean, that gets big again in the 20th century, but it actually is very strong in the late 19th in Union churches. And Northern preachers would argue that ours is a just war. Lincoln was elected legitimately. He won the vote in the Electoral College. And this is a case where the will of the minority, the South, is trying to defy the will of the majority. That's not right. And then there was a lot of rallying around the flag. This is the flag from Fort Sumter. And Fort Sumter is read as an event where Southerners were disrespecting the U.S. flag, that sacred object of American nationalism. And so this war was read as a sign of God's special providence. The nation is sent forth to fight the battle of heaven. If there ever was a war undertaken in the name of God in his service, as his command under approbation, it is this war to which the whole North has risen as one man. This is Leonard Swain, a preacher. You have lots of references to the hands of God in Northern newspapers and his sermons. And much as had happened in the South, preachers began to support the war with nationalist messages, particularly your Methodist and Baptist and those abolitionist-friendly churches. There are some churches that stay aligned with the more conservative Democrats in that era, but Roman Catholics most famously, though, there's huge Irish support for the war in the early years among Catholics. And the mainline religious presses also, like they had in the South, began increasingly publishing secular and military news at times and pro-war pieces. And you'll find throughout various political and religious editorials lots of references in both the South and the North to, I don't mean to demean it, but random Old Testament parallels, things that were you would unlikely to hear from the pulpit much on Sunday morning today. There's a lot of searching the scriptures for comparable kind of events that might have happened in biblical times. And the Old Testament gets dived in significantly. We don't have much time to go into this today, but it's also fair to say that Christian groups play a huge role in creating relief organizations in the South. We have the U.S. Sanitary Commission and the U.S. Christian Commission, both established to provide relief to Union soldiers. They're deeply religious bodies. The U.S. Sanitary Commission is established with the help of Henry Bellows, a Congregationalist pastor, and then started and really manned by Christian women in the North, particularly New England. And then the U.S. Christian Commission was started by the YMCA, which then was a deeply evangelical religious organization. Famously, Walt Whitman actually volunteers and does a stint with the Christian Commission, which he believes is the better of the organizations. This is a photograph I love that shows the Christian Commission on a battlefield. But they provided Bibles, but also relief supplies and medical care to soldiers. Chaplains become as important in the North as they do in the South. In fact, Lincoln is actually more adamant about having a chaplain appointed to all units of the Army. That doesn't always happen because sometimes there's a shortage of people who are willing to go to war. There's particularly a shortage of priests to work with the Catholic soldiers. And then there's actually a shortage in both the South and the North of Baptist clergy to be chaplains as well. And that's largely because the Baptists in that day and age really emphasized separation of church and state. And so it was morally problematic for many Baptist ministers to serve as chaplains or soldiers in the war. There's another famous picture of some Union chaplains. So early on, the war turns against the North. But it's fair to say, as we talked a little bit about last week, that Union losses early on were viewed as a sign of divine punishment for not providing, an Emancipation Proclamation. In 1863, on January 1st, Lincoln issues the official Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the war is already slightly turned to the North side. We talked about that last week. But it really begins to, in a lopsided way, turn in favor of the North in 1863, and many ministers and church folks take that as, that happens because they believe that happens because of the Emancipation Proclamation, because finally we're embracing God's call to free those held in bondage. It also is an era that begins to allow the recruitment of Black soldiers, which really bolsters the war effort in huge ways. So it's important to point that out as well. But morally and spiritually, many folks believe that the Emancipation Proclamation is the reason that God is now empowering the North. He was punishing the North during that era of, of more pain, of punishment, when we weren't morally on the right side, because we weren't actively trying to abolish slavery. We were just trying to preserve the Union. But that's not to say that the Union's cause was always a righteous one. William Sherman is a fascinating figure. He's particularly fascinating for his brutal tactics. He had this idea, this is one of his famous quotes: "War is cruelty. There is no use trying to perform it. And the crueler it is, the sooner it will be over," Sherman would say. So he was famous for his scorched earth tactics. The march to Georgia, the march to the sea, and then eventually to the Carolinas are both very famous events. Even Grant and Lincoln thought his tactics were too extreme. But even Sherman's soldiers were thought to be holy warriors by many Northerners. In fact, one of the famous stories about Sherman's soldiers is that Sherman would be somebody who called them holy Christian soldiers. And among the stories that became widely circulated was that when Sherman was marching through Georgia, one of the regimental bands began playing the hymn known as the Old 100. You know the hymn, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow," right? So the regimental band begins playing the Old 100. I enjoy the fact that I'm making hand gestures you can't see here, like I'm drumming, but that's going on. Playing the Old 100, and suddenly more and more segments, more and more bands begin to join in, and more of the soldiers begin to sing, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow." It begins to go throughout Sherman's ranks. They quieted down and eventually broke camp and proceeded through central Georgia to embrace some pretty violent tactics that probably included destroying property, harming people in terrible ways, and of course robbing people in terrible ways too. But Sherman would turn to another commander and reflect or quip, "Christian army I've got, noble fellows, God will take care of them, war improves character." Sometimes religious people use religious language to justify unchristian behavior. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. This is the famous AME Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, who was one of the first African Americans to serve as a chaplain in the Civil War before he's a bishop. When he encountered Sherman's army, he was abhorred by the tactics he saw Sherman use. Turner's a fascinating figure. Andre Johnson actually offers a class on him and is one of the world's experts on him. He teaches that at MTS. And if you have any interest in learning more about Turner, you should audit that class. But many Northerners, particularly ministers, began to argue that the war was serving God's ultimate purpose. It was going to usher in a new utopian age to the U.S. It was going to make things more beautiful, an age of progress. Many of them talked about this being a time where we're going to help usher in the kingdom of God. And you find millennial language and talk about kingdom of God, particularly in the later years of the war, really pervasive throughout sermons. The war was bringing about a good. A new, more holy Christian chaste civilization would be brought by the work of the Union armies. It's in this period, in fact, it's a little bit earlier in the war, where you've got this famous hymn being written by Julia Ward Howe. "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on." The war was seen as a holy war, and this hymn embodies that idea. But as I said, beginning in late 1862, or a little earlier than that by some accounts, the war begins to turn more and more against the Confederacy. Southerners had to reinterpret what this meant. Is God not on our side? And what they often concluded that these losses are because Union forces increasingly began to occupy churches as they took over territory. And it became common, this is one of Edwin Stanton's, Lincoln's Secretary of War's tactics, to turn over the churches of disloyal congregations to Northern denominational leaders. This was something that deeply bothered Southern people. Lincoln would lessen the force of that, but this is one story that I find illuminating. So in 1862, Episcopal Reverend J.R. Stewart of Alexandria, Virginia, ignored a local military ordinance to pray for Lincoln. This was Episcopalian, and if you know anything about the Episcopalian Church, you may know that praying for the government is a pretty common thing to do. This is a church that had been taken over by, or a city that had been taken over by Union forces. Well, what ends up happening on the morning of February 9th, 1862, a State Department detective, aware of the fact the church wasn't actually praying for Lincoln and the Union, actually came into the church and ordered Stewart to pray for Lincoln. The minister ignored the order. This led to members of the 80 Illinois Cavalry entering the church, and with swords drawn and pistols to the head, they took the preacher Stewart into custody. And this is General Alexander McCook. Rebellion, even now, once and for all, I give you to understand that clergymen of the Episcopal Church will be required to use the prayer book just as they are printed. You shall pray for the President of the United States or be hung. We are handling you now with kid gloves. This is only an experiment. If it doesn't succeed, better that it seems to be doing, we will try something else. We will try the virtues of ropes, which in my opinion should have been done from the start. Clergymen and churches are told, get on board with the Union, or prepared to do jail time or worse. Well, the South ends up, of course, losing the war. But the mythology of the Southern cause being righteous continues. The term lost cause begins to be used fairly early on in the South, as early as 1866. By a man by the name of Edward Pollard, but base surrender after the conclusion of the war is up to battle evil. And that evil, of course, was embodied by the Yankees. The antebellum South was a pure and holy land, these folks argued. The real issue of the war was not slavery. We don't even need to mention slavery. It was instead states' rights. And the Union was the aggressor. Very much the Southern cause was being compared to the life, death, and eventually the resurrection of Christ, because the idea was that if the South could return to its Christian roots and become more holy, more chaste again, well, then the South could indeed rise again. In the years following the war, this lost cause mythology would be embodied in new statues that were built all over the South, many of which would not be built until the early 20th century even. Over 1,000 monuments were placed in Southern communities through the world. Stone Mountain in Georgia is one very famous one. Of course, the Forest statue in Memphis that has generated such conversation was another. Confederate Memorial Day would be established to talk about that lost cause. The KKK would emerge as a promoter of the lost cause beginning in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865, and versions of the Klan, though they look differently now, continue to this day. So I want to conclude by just taking a minute. I know we're about out of time, and I want to leave a little time for questions to talk about why this matters today. There's a few reasons I could highlight. The Civil War is enormously important in American history, and if you want to understand American history, you need to understand the Civil War. In fact, Shelby Foote, from Memphis, right, would argue that it was this event, the Civil War, that would seal the nation as a whole. And it was actually a time when rhetorically people went from referring to the country as these United States to this United States. No longer were we just Tennesseans or New Yorkans or Californians. Instead, we were Americans. It's also a time of incredible technology advancement. I could go on about how, for example, the funeral industry is becomes modernized in this era because of the need they died back to the North. Technology, and you could even argue that in terms of religion, it's the war that begins to usher in a time of new religious thinking in the country. We talked in the first lesson about how biblical literalism begins to be shattered in the North because of the debate over slavery. Well, that opens the door for new forms of religious expression and even liberalism. Certainly the optimism that begins to pervade the North following the war opens up the door for the new sciences and liberal Christian theology with all the good and all the bad that come with that. And then for us today, I would argue something else we always got to keep in mind. Theologically, the war is a good reminder that we can confuse our own biases, our own designs, our own core truths with God's will. We saw the North do that. We saw the South do that. And I guess I pivot back to Lincoln. In great contests, each side claims to act in accordance with the will of God, but one may be and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. I could go on, but I'm going to end it there so we can take a couple questions today. Pete, do you want to play a role in that?
Mute here. We have a lot of good questions this morning. Several are around the whether or not there were ministers either in the South or the North who opposed the war. Let's tackle that one first, and then question about freedom of religion. Did the Confederate Constitution have anything about freedom of religion?
Could you say that again, Pete? My internet connection is a little bit wonky today.
Yep. So the first one is, were there Southern ministers or Northern ministers who opposed the war?
There were Southern ministers who opposed the war. I'm from Knoxville, Tennessee, for example, and there were abolitionists in Appalachia, for example, Mountain South, not big slaveholding territory. And there were random other ones littered throughout the South. It certainly wasn't normal, and you could get yourself into a great deal of trouble, even face mob violence for opposing the war. But it did exist, yeah, in the South. There are some exceptional cases of that.
How about in the North?
There were definitely anti-war ministers in the North. And famously, there were a number of Democrats. So Democrats were sort of mostly anti-war and wanted Lincoln to settle the war. And they often get called the Copperhead churches, but there are which is the nickname for those Northern Democrats, snakes that could bite you. You get it. Regardless, Lincoln didn't like them much, but there were these Northern ministers who very much opposed the war and thought that the pulpit should never be used for preaching about politics, and thought that the war was atrocious and should just be ended, and that Lincoln was acting outside of his constitutional authority in perpetuating it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
For the Southern Constitution, was there any provision for freedom of religion or separation of church and state as was in the original U.S. Constitution?
I'm unsure about that. I would say that it looks a little bit more like a theocracy in a sense than what was set up in the U.S. Constitution. Of course, there's a great deal debate about how deeply enshrined separation of church and state actually is in the original Constitution. Yeah, I'm really sorry about the connection issues. I'm not sure what's going on my end. I may have my router maybe dying or something.
As we're thinking about implications of this material for today, theologically, what might help prevent the over-identification of a particular political position with the will of God?
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard question, Pete. I think as Christians, we need to be aware that we all have ingrained biases, all of us. it's just, you can't be a human being and not. And you need to be someone who begins to study and recognize that some of what you believe is because of the influences that have come into your life, both good and bad, and because of your own social location, and also because of your own cultural identity. And you need to be open to allowing the gospel to challenge that when you read the Bible and when you engage in in that thing. And you also need to recognize that your way is not the only way. So I think a lot of it starts with individual accountability and us trying to be aware of ourselves and who we are. And as
Mhm. Come on, come on, come on, come on.
ministers, I think it's really important. Yeah, I'm sorry. I know my internet's freezing today. I do not know what's going on. My apologies. Was it constant throughout the presentation?
It was, it was sporadic.
I'm
So,
sorry.
yeah,
I don't know what's happening. I may need to replace some technology in my house, or it may just be a Zoom problem. I don't know.
right. Hard to say. Well, we're nearing the end, and I just want to thank you for these presentations. Very helpful and illuminating, and particularly appropriate as we consider our own struggles in these still United States. That we've been through a lot of conflicts, and clearly the Civil War was the major one so far in U.S. history. May we learn from those lessons from our ancestors in the faith and our ancestors in this country as we try to move forward in ways that respect each other's dignity as human beings and recognize that we are all under the same God, even as we struggle sometimes to understand what God is calling us to be and to do. That leads me to a promotion at the end, which is that one of the reasons theological study is so important, whether it be in a seminary or Sunday morning seminary or in whatever context, is so that we can deepen our understanding of faith, and hopefully that will help us to be better practitioners of the faith as well. So thank you, Dr. Turner, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning. Remember, next Sunday we will be on a sabbatical, a Sabbath, and then we'll return the following Sunday on September 6th, I believe it is, for Dr. Jody Hill. So please do check in on the Sunday Morning Seminary site, the Memphis Theological Seminary website, for updates and schedules, and we'll see you all, we hope, in 2 weeks.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.